Hello, I'm Shane Kilkelly.
I'm Kyle Thompson.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit, the podcast of the cybernetic Marxists. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about cybernetic Marxists, actually. We're going to be talking about a book. It's a bit of a strange book. It's called Red Plenty. I think it was published in 2010 and written by one Francis Spufford. It's not exactly a work of fiction, and it's not exactly a historical work either. I think Spufford describes it as a fairy tale, which is a bit strange.
Yeah.
And it's a sort of fictionalized account of the Soviet Union through the 50s and 60s and the kind of beginning of the 70s, and specifically circling around this ambition to create a cybernetic communism that would provide just incredible bounty and plenty for all of its citizens, and ultimately why that didn't really pan out. And it does so by taking the perspectives of various sort of characters occupying various parts in the Soviet hierarchy and following them over the course of two and a bit decades. So, Kyle, what did you think of the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I guess I'm going through a pretty hectic time in my life right now, and it's been a little bit rough, and reading this extremely depressing book didn't help at all.
No, it's so depressing.
However, I have a lot of positive things to say about the book, and I will say that, I mean, this is just a personal note, but I'm moving away from the town I've lived in. I lived in Kyoto, Japan for about 5 years now, and went to grad school here, did my doctoral course here, and didn't finish. And this book kind of read like my reading list from my doctoral program. Like, it doesn't cover every book I read during that time, but the notes, the footnotes and the endnotes, the endnotes, I should say, pretty much just cover like, oh yeah, I read that, I read that. I read that.
Nice.
So I feel like I pretty much read like a very similar bibliography to what the author read in preparing this book. So I do feel pretty well qualified to speak to what it has to say, although I suffer from exactly the same kind of myopia that he mentions in the acknowledgments about how, he only used English sources. Well, I only had English sources as well. So it's like I can confirm the extent to which this book has interesting things to say about the books he read, but, I'm not a Sovietologist in any sense of the word at all.
Yeah, that's it. It's interesting that it's it's familiar material, because for me it's like I kind of had a relatively weak grasp on the entirety of kind of Soviet history and specifically of this period. Actually, I found the book to be very enlightening.
Yeah, it presents the material in a very comprehensible way. Even the quite technical stuff is fairly easy to grasp here compared to in some texts. But I think as for my feelings of the book, about the book, it was just a really difficult read because it kind of brought me back to that place of just sort of deep depression that was characteristic of all my years in grad school. And actually this book was to a significant extent inspired by the work of Michael Ellman, and reading his socialist planning book for like the third time or something was just the thing that like convinced me to give up on my doctorate, because it was just as Spufford says, he has a very sort of biting style, and he's kind of he's in that book. He's kind of trying to convince people to never attempt this again. I think is sort of like the message there. And so I think it finally got through to me that was like, oh, this is probably not a fruitful direction for research. So yeah, it was a really, really difficult read. Not in the sense that the prose is difficult, but just in the sense that it was emotionally very draining.
Yeah, it's yeah, because like again, the prose isn't difficult at all. I found it to be quite a breezy read, and I don't read fiction very quickly usually. I do have one small issue with the kind of way it's presented in that like some of the chapters are pretty heavy with the kind of economic and the political sort of theory and like the technical stuff. But then there are some chapters where there's a lot of window dressing initially, and then two characters sit down at a table and they expo dump the political and technical stuff, and then they go outside and have a walk, and it's kind of bookended by stuff that like it sets the scene, but I didn't get a massive amount out of, you know.
Right, in the sense that you felt that the fiction didn't add very much to the sort of historical details he was trying to convey.
I suspect I might have just missed some because like the one I'm thinking of in particular is the kind of the lady who's settling in at the science town out in the middle of nowhere, and I think I might have just been breezing over some of the details, and I think maybe a second read would give a bit more. But no, I thought it was very well written, and it did a good job of presenting these kind of like interlocking forces in such a way that it becomes obvious to the reader what the contradictions are, and it's like they'll just sort of like characters will be describing some like dynamic of how the economy works, and it just becomes very clear what the perverse incentives are and what the problems are going to be in later chapters, which I think is kind of like it's not easy to explain that sort of stuff. So I think the author did a great job there.
Yeah, and I think it works so much better in this kind of novelistic style than it does in, say, the style of normal sociological prose, because you can describe these things in a very sort of detached way as an outside observer describing the motion of a system. But the way that the author here really gets in the head of these characters and describes their sort of feelings of anxiety and what concerns them, I think does a lot to make this comprehensible in quite an effective way. It reminds me a lot of like a sort of like 19th century French novels, like Balzac or something. You know, that kind of like sociological novel that was popular at that time, not in English but in French, just trying to grasp like social change through different characters.
Yeah, and I think it's important for this work, especially because like, and it becomes very clear in the kind of early chapters that this is quite, from our perspective now, this is quite an alien culture and an alien way of seeing the world. That like the way the characters initially sort of interact with the society they're in and the kind of historical ambitions of that society are very different from the way we think of ourselves today and our society. It actually seems very strange initially, and it would be hard to see how you would pull that off without kind of having this narrative style to kind of ground it in. But yeah, so it's divided into 6 parts, and they kind of all in each part there's an introduction that's written from the author's voice, followed by chapters from the character's voice. And in the introduction to part 1, we're told that it's not a fiction, it's not really a history, it's more of a fairy tale, and he kind of links it to these Russian folk myths that would often include a component of like a cornucopia or a horn of plenty that would produce ham and butter and all the nice things in the world, and that there was this with an obvious sort of desire for better conditions to live in, and ultimately like how the mid-century Soviet Union like made some sincere attempt to actually do that for its citizens, and particularly on the direction of Nikita Khrushchev, that wanting to create this planned economy that would be technically driven and optimized in such a way that it would just provide endless bounty and just flowing commodities for the citizens in such a way that would be like more efficient and would outperform the kind of wasteful chaos of a market economy. And ultimately, like by the end of the Soviet Union, nobody believed in this dream anymore, really. But for quite a while, it was taken seriously.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting because what they would have thought of as plenty is very much the world we grew up in, right? Sort of their wildest dreams of wealth. I mean, I grew up relatively poor for most of my childhood, but I could see around me, or visit friends' houses who really lived that standard of living that these characters aspired to, right? So I think it's important to note that material plenty that these socialists were looking for is certainly not a thing that capitalism can provide for everyone, but it did provide it for a fairly sizable number of people. Yeah. And I think that the particular problems that we have right now with capitalism are, to some extent, the kind of problems of want and scarcity. But often they're problems of a different kind than the ones that these characters were principally concerned with, right?
Oh, definitely, yeah. And like even from the very sort of opening, the first chapter takes place in like 1938. It opens in a cramped train station, people crowded together, and like the first character we're introduced to, Leonid Vitalovich. He's a mathematician who's like, kind of pondering where he's going to get a pair of boots, or like by what sort of means he could convince the state to provide him with either a repair for the current pair of boots that he has, or new ones. And it's a really interesting sort of opening chapter, because you get a sense of this like very different sort of way of thinking about things. Like he sort of he's watching around himself for pickpockets, and he makes the kind of like allusion to extracting surplus value. Like there's an open disdain for the kind of perceived remote capitalist economies, and a sense of collective purpose.
Yeah, it's interesting to note that, because well, just in passing, I just want to note that this person is usually known by his last name, Kantorovich, as this famous mathematician, but in Russia it's not so common to use that name, so the author opted to use the middle name as their last name. I mean, Russian names are extremely complex and strange, and I don't really know very much about them, but I know the naming scheme that they have and the one we have do not really map onto each other very well at all. So that is a thing that is kind of confusing about this book, but yeah, as you were saying, it's interesting to note that at the start of the story, he finds himself very much like admits the scarcity that he is trying to get rid of, right? Like that he's stuck in it. Like everybody is poor, right? That is the world that he is living in.
Yeah, definitely. And he is dreaming about a better world. He has this kind of interesting take where he's like, he's lucky enough to live in the only country on the planet where human beings have seized the power to shape events according to reason, and not simply be buffeted about by chance and superstition and greed. So again, like there's this like soaked in this kind of ideology of like really wanting this socialism stuff to play out properly, and to be a reasoned approach to managing an economy and providing for citizens.
Yes,
which is so different to what we're kind of accustomed to, the kind of like boundless cynicism of our current sort of moment.
Right. Yeah, he's been brought up in this ideology, and it makes sense to him. especially as a mathematician, right? It's appealing, and of course, also he sees in the fact that anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union at this time is not as bad as it is in Germany.
Yeah,
which
he's much better off here.
yeah, which was previously considered to sort of be like the pinnacle of science and reason and culture. That was the land that many German Jews would identify with, right, as this kind of cultured, educated country where they could survive because of their commitment to German intellectual life. That all went away, right, with the Nazis, and sort of grasping a hold of this ideology of scientific, rational socialism makes a lot of sense for him because, he is a mathematician, he's poor, he wants more, and also his chances of survival in this country are better than they are in Germany. Not to say there weren't a lot of Jews killed in the Soviet Union, or that anti-Semitism wasn't quite prevalent in the country, but looking across the border, so to speak, he still feels a certain attachment to this country in a way that he certainly wouldn't towards Germany.
There's a definite optimism. There's like a real sort of bright sort of optimism to the way he sort of thinks and speaks. And as he's like taking the train to his day job, at which he's, I think, tasked with optimizing the throughput of like some factory producing wooden beams or something. He's kind of daydreaming through the kind of problem of like, well, if you optimize a machine with its inputs and outputs and all that kind of stuff, well, you can kind of generalize that to a line of machines and a production line. And it's like, well, if you do that, you can kind of do it at the inter-factory level. It's like, okay, right, so the supply chains between factories, you could do the same optimizations. And he runs through it in his head, and he starts to realize that if you did that to the entire economy, you could kind of give yourself 4, 5, 6% compounding growth constantly. And that would just keep going. And he starts to see it. He starts to see the possibility that this is an idea he could work on and get somewhere with. And you could actually kind of create that horn of plenty for yourself by just kind of optimizing the stuff you're already doing. It's not even a massive change he's proposing there. It's just kind of taking the productive processes they already have and trimming away the fat in both the inside the firm and in the kind of interactions between firms.
Yeah, he describes it as order snatched out of the grasp of entropy,
which is an idea that's very central to cybernetics overall.
Right. Yes. And we'll certainly get at that if we get to Mirowski, because there's a deep history there. But yeah, I think the important thing here is that, well, I mean, first of all, this is a thing that actually happened. He did come up with this idea working for the Plywood Trust of Leningrad. But the important thing aside from that is that it says in the book, he only needed to think of the machines as abstract propositions, each one effectively an equation in solid form. So it's this abstracting power that, like you said, could afford this kind of epochal change in society. And like, he has this sense that this is like a momentous occasion, because it says, in the era before 2:30 this afternoon, the people arranging the flow of workers in factories had been able to get by with a fair degree of efficiency by using rules of thumb and educated intuition. But after 2:30, he's made this, world historical significant discovery, because the important thing was that he was coming up with a form of mathematics that was actually something previous algebra had not been able to do, right? So, assuming this stuff is of any, real economic significance, which, I mean, it's used all the time now, he really did make a kind of discovery, like a significant addition to the sorts of things we can do as human beings that wasn't previously possible.
Oh yeah, definitely. it's a huge step forward. But like for the moment, he's just sort of like seems to be kind of just working on the idea in his spare time and kind of biding his time for a while.
Yeah, and the you were mentioning before, like the country is this kind of place of reason, and the ultimate sort of misunderstanding and kind of fallacy that he falls into in his thinking and what represents the ideology that he's buying into is this statement that the Soviet economy was a clean sheet of paper on which reason was writing. And we're going to see in this book how that is absolutely not true.
Yeah, I mean, spoilers for the end, but it sort of doesn't work out ultimately.
Yeah,
but for very good reasons and reasons that are worth understanding, especially going forward from our time now with ambitions towards effectively the same goal, like the idea of a computerized economy that could. Effortlessly produce enough to feed everyone. That brings us on to chapter 2, or part 1, chapter 2, because they're not actually numbered sequentially in that way. In 1959, where Khrushchev is on a flight to the United States for a stately visit and a bit of a wander around. It's an interesting chapter because it kind of gives you a bit of an insight into Khrushchev's sort of way of thinking and how he has this sort of like definite ambition to bring about this this era of plenty, and like he acknowledges the kind of the darkness of the founding of the Soviet Union, the Stalin years, and kind of believes that this is now a sort of like if not a clean slate, it's at least a slate that has been rubbed clean and can be used as a springboard to get to actually nice things in the coming couple of decades.
Yeah, he says we did the dirty work so they could inherit a clean world.
Yeah. And it's definitely like, I mean, Khrushchev is definitely, as it even comes from him being kind of the only real working class leader of the Soviet Union, and someone who grew up with like proper an understanding of real sort of orthodox Marxism, that he maintained this sort of ambition and this kind of like forward thinking perspective throughout his whole career, and even when it started to kind of go off the rails, and even into his retirement. But at the moment, yeah, he's going to visit the States, and he kind of arrives, and he's kind of like he's very impressed with the glitz and the shininess of all the things in America, and the cars and the lovely infrastructure and the houses, and he seems even like taken aback at just how good it all sort of appears. And he does have this constant apprehension as well that like the glitz of the appearances, like he sort of remarks on seeing the rows of like single occupant cars like off into the horizon on the highways, and he kind of remarks at how inefficient that actually is to have such a waste of transport potential.
Yeah, there's that. There's a lot of really good characterization of Khrushchev here as someone who is deeply insecure, but kind of just gets by sheer willpower and like kind of bluster, like, which is seems to be pretty accurate to the sort of person he was. That he's kind of renowned to be a sort of faintly ridiculous figure, but one who is very strong-willed.
In this chapter, he makes an ass of himself quite a few times, and he seems to kind of reveal that he doesn't fully get how the United States actually works. Like at one point, he's meeting with Wall Street people, and they're kind of yapping about something. But anyway, the Wall Street guys are like, well, if a piece of legislation is popular on Wall Street, it's the kiss of death in Washington. And like Khrushchev doesn't get it. Like he doesn't get that because he's accustomed to a much more simple, purely hierarchical system of organization. He doesn't seem to understand that there are these kind of like deeply entangled but slightly opposing poles of life in America. That like Wall Street doesn't control Washington, and Washington doesn't really control Wall Street. But like they're
what I love about that scene though is that there's so many different levels of misunderstanding that are going on.
Yeah.
Because it's like, yeah, Khrushchev thinks about, like, his way of thinking about capitalism is first, like, thinking about it in terms of sort of the caricatures he would have been brought up with. But he, like, he thinks about it in terms of the way the hierarchy of the Soviet Union is organized, like you said, where like bosses give orders and people follow orders. And it's like, so these are the top bosses, so everyone must follow their orders, right?
Yeah.
Like, so that's like his misunderstanding. But it's also the case that the Wall Street executives are also like in a bit of misunderstanding, because they've fallen hold of the opposite illusion, which is that they aren't in charge of things.
Yeah.
Because like the thing is that like there's been a lot of sort of Marxist research about the state, right? That happened in that happened in the 20th century, and there's a lot of sort of like ruling class theory and like people like Domhoff and stuff who actually like studied like how does the capitalist ruling class rule, right? And one thing that's sort of obvious is that if you are an executive of like a Fortune 500 company, you are the private dictator of your company, right? Mm-hmm. Like you give orders, people follow orders in a way that is not all that dissimilar from what Khrushchev sort of assumes is true about society at large, right? But the thing is that because you're so used to being obeyed all the time, if you can't get what you want because of political interference or opposition, then you sort of misattribute a much greater power to the opposition than actually exists. Because your baseline is everybody does exactly what you want all the time, right?
Yeah.
So it's like for the capitalists are like, oh no, we don't control anything. And then there's like a line where Khrushchev is like, well, I won't pay any attention to you then.
Yeah.
Just kind of like calling them on their bullshit, because like, of course they have power, right? But they don't have power in exactly the way he thinks they do. So it's kind of like both sides don't really understand themselves, and they also don't understand the other side of the conversation.
There's a bit of a theme in this chapter of like the actual dynamics being much more subtle and complex than the players realize they are. So like Khrushchev, misapprehends the actualities in America, and like his hosts also don't seem to fully understand where he's coming from either, and they see each other in ideological terms. And there's even that sort of bit with the his marveling at the street vendor hamburger sort of thing as a wonderfully sort of amazing way to feed the populace and this kind of thing. And it's like there's layers of ideology that are preventing them from actually getting a hold of the kind of concrete realities that are underlying it. So everyone's misunderstanding everyone. It's pretty fantastic.
Yeah. There's a lot of sort of like cross-cultural misunderstandings everywhere in this chapter, and it does do a lot to sort of exhibit the Soviet attitude towards America, which is a very like love-hate thing, right? Where like they have so much admiration for American mass production and technology, and like the plenty of America, but on the other hand they still have that critique of capitalism, right? So that was like very characteristic of Soviet thinking at that point in time, and I think the author does a really good job of getting that across, because like as I think it's either mentioned in the notes or something in the text itself, the Soviets didn't really have that attitude as much towards Europeans, right? Like they were like, well, yeah, like, they weren't so hot on Europe, right? Like, I think there was like a thing that's mentioned somewhere in the text where it's like the Soviets and Americans kind of had like this common understanding of being these like frontier countries and being obsessed with like sort of the mass production, like this thing about scale, right? In a way that Europeans really didn't. So yeah, it's a really interesting sort of cultural relationship, and one I think that the author brings to life pretty well here.
Yeah, it's great, and it's really really nice piece of writing. Chapter 3 kind of expands on that a little bit, the sort of like fascination with the American way of living, where there's an exhibition, an American exhibition taking place in Moscow, and this student Galina is being kind of sent along. She's being directed by the state in some way to kind of go along and kind of essentially goad the presenters into I don't know, admitting that they're horrifying American shills or something. But like, you know,
she's a heckler.
doing her bit. Yeah, she's a heckler, exactly. She's doing her bit to represent the Soviet Union. But it's kind of fun because like she's very very into it. Like this is the way she's going to get a nice apartment in Moscow. Essentially, that like
yes,
if she impresses the handlers here, and you know she's been instructed to loudly question the Yanks and to draw them on unemployment figures and this sort of thing.
Exactly right. So yeah, she's like a member of the Young Communist League, and this is one of the sort of duties that she can do in order to get political capital and try to advance her career, because she's the daughter of like a minor official out in the boonies, but she has dreams of getting into Moscow, getting a residence permit in Moscow, which, because of the way that the Soviet Union was organized, where movement was highly restricted, your geographical residence credentials said a lot about where you fit into the hierarchy of the society.
Yeah, yeah. And this is a very, very hierarchical society, as the author gets into a bit later. But anyway, so she's at this thing, and she's like absolutely stunned at the images of American prosperity. There's some kind of like it's again highlighting this kind of like cultural divide where the Soviet kids seem to really value scientific and technical and artistic achievement, whereas the Americans are putting across an image of kind of almost banal prosperity, where it's just ordinary white picket fence kind of stuff. And she has this kind of line that like she keeps expecting the screens to start showing technical and artistic achievements that the Americans are especially proud of, which just shows the mentality.
They actually excel at something, right?
Rather than excelling at like, because the images on the screen are just like, yeah, white picket fence stuff and kind of like ordinary pleasantries. And it's a parade of consumer goods and ordinary comforts which are being put on display here, and you see the huge contrast between the ambitions for the two super nations and what they value. You know?
And it's just so interesting because it's like the communists say that they want plenty for the working class throughout society, and what they actually want is like this extremely meritocratic dictatorship of reason, right? That the greatest achievements must be achieved. Like, we must make great works, right? Whereas the Americans claim to be about individual achievement, but actually what they're providing is this very banal, like, lowest common denominator vision of what culture is. And I mean, there is a convergence that kind of happens later in the century that he touches on, but it is very interesting that like their stated values and their like exhibited values are completely at odds in both cases.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And like even the title of the chapter is Little Plastic Beakers, because that's the object of her fascination, the like colored plastic tumblers that she sees on display for the kitchenware. And she's
something you could pick up in a dollar store.
Right, yeah. And that's part of the point of what the hosts are trying to convey to her, that like these aren't images of extravagance in America. This is stuff that you would expect the average kind of line worker to be able to afford. Yeah, and like the Soviet guys kind of counter with like, is this the national exhibition of a powerful and important country, or is it the branch of a department store? Not realizing that for the Yanks, they are one and the same. You know,
Yes.
that is exactly the point they're trying to convey. Those are one and the same thing. You know, and like. She eventually manages to fluster him, but only by like basically ragging on his racial background, and like kind of that loses the sympathy of the crowd entirely. So it's not really clear how that works
it's
out
like
for
the things that she says about race relations in America are not incorrect in any way, but they're simply uncouth, right?
Yeah.
Like they just it's like you just don't say that to
She's
someone
such an asshole.
because
It's incredible.
it's just extremely mean, right? That like, yeah, because her interlocutor, who is working for the U.S. government and this exhibition in the Soviet Union, is a young black man, and he is spouting just absolute propaganda about race relations in America, right? That like she can catch him on that because, you know, that is the thing that the Soviet propagandists actually did catch Americans on, is like, hey, this is really messed up. And, you know, and it's still a thing today, right? Like Radio Sputnik, which is funded by Russian government, they have like that show by any means necessary, and it actually has a lot of really like striking points about race relations in America that they commonly bring up, right? So like fun like hitting that weak point in American ideology was a thing that the Soviets did and actually had a pretty significant impact, but to make it so personal to attack this guy,
doing
and to
it
just
to
say
the one
like,
guy, the one this one fucking individual. She's just such a scumbag.
like,
it's incredible.
And it's like, you know, his personal dreams for what he might achieve in the future, and then just pointing out like, no, this is like a brutal system of racial oppression, and like all your sort of like fancy words about liberal progress mean nothing in the face of just like this system. It's just extremely mean and said in a very mean-spirited way, right? Like she's just grasping at anything to get back at him with, in the face of like this very like sort of smooth and produced charming presentation. Like, you know, his Russian is excellent, and you know, he's trained in the way of like a TV presenter or something, right? But yeah, she finally gets at him with that, and actually this ends up ruining her career, right?
Yeah, she doesn't go very much further, and like she pops up towards the end as well in kind of not fantastic circumstances. But that's where the chapter leaves off, and we're kind of brought on to chapter 4, titled "White Dust," where we meet a new character, Emil Scheidolin, I think. And he's on his way to visit his fiance's family in the countryside outside Moscow. There's kind of an interesting bit here where it's like, even though it's like Moscow itself is barely over the horizon, this is a very hard place to reach. Like, he has to take a train and then a bus and then
There's
walk.
no road.
There's no road. He has to walk across like a fucking swamp to get there. And as he's doing so, he's kind of like, he's an economist, and he's kind of like dreaming of this like consciously arranged society. And that kind of like an opening up of new kind of horizons for economists within the Soviet Union. And kind of like, he also kind of talks about like how he's just kind of daydreaming to himself, but it's kind of like pondering on like how economists are now starting to be able to talk to mathematicians and biologists and computer scientists to kind of come together and share ideas and kind of start to build this movement towards the consciously arranged society.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's kind of a combination in his thinking between this sort of economics thinking, where he says that, you know, value unites all realms of human activity, and a little bit of like the kind of dreams that Marx had about communism that we kind of discussed in our alienation episode, right?
Yeah, he's got a really
About
great sort of bit here where it's like the makers of the things made turned alike into commodities, and the motion of society turned into a zombie dance, a grim cavorting whirl in which the objects and people blurred together until objects were half alive and people were half dead. It's a pretty fantastic way of putting alienation, you know?
Yeah, that's a pretty good gloss of like the first, few chapters of Capital, right? So definitely well written, and it just shows that like what his intellectual perspective is, right? Like he does honestly have in the West, the term vulgar Marxism is thrown around a lot, or was thrown around a lot by Western Marxists, and there was like this like obvious disdain for Soviet Marxism as like basically like intellectually facile, right? Because the humanists and social scientists in the Soviet Union were eliminated during the Stalin period and replaced with technical experts. There was this is very much like looking down your nose at them, and that still persists today. But what he's trying to show here is that on the basics, this person gets it, right? Like Emil understands more or less what the point of Marx's critique was, and is trying to combine that with economics and with cybernetics, and that's sort of his dream for the future, and he's like a good stand-in for that movement as a whole.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, sort of continuing on the Marxist bit, part two's introduction sort of picks up with beginning by pointing out that like Marx predicted the wrong revolution as it regarded Russia. That like the revolution that Marx was kind of going towards or wanting to, or like presumed would happen with that was that an advanced capitalist society would reach a point where its own internal contradictions would lead to a crisis, and that like the socialist revolutionaries will be able to inherit, essentially undamaged, the full productive capacity of that capitalist society. But that's like emphatically not what happened in Russia. It's like a very, very backward society that, or an underdeveloped material base that found itself in this position of like very quickly needing to build up that material base that should have happened under capitalist. I mean, should in quotes, but like would have happened under capitalist development before they could get on with the real project of building actual socialism.
Right, and this is a thing that it's not mentioned in the book, but it's a thing that was called socialist primitive accumulation, taking up Marx's idea of primitive accumulation, this sort of originary gathering of capital together by, means fair and foul, but usually foul.
Yeah, very, very foul in this case. And that, like,
I mean, it was certainly also very foul in the case of capitalism, but it was a little bit more spread out over time,
yes.
Right? This was a very sort of like abrupt, let's just do this in a very militarized and organized fashion.
And very quickly.
And in the White Dust chapter, we see the sort of remnants of that process where the village that Emil goes to, he's like, did something happen here? And like, because he doesn't know, like, he was kept in the dark growing up about the extent of the violence in the collectivization process, right? And he learns about the extreme poverty of the peasantry and how, there's all this talk in Soviet society, and especially in Moscow, about how, this is a worker-peasant alliance and is an advancing economy and everything's industrializing. But if you go to the countryside, you can see that there is surplus extraction that's happening in the crudest possible manner of just basically stealing things from the peasants and using them as a basis for building industrialization.
Oh yeah, they were being fleeced, and that was that crash industrialization was to just take all the surplus value from crops and funnel all of the proceeds into the expansion of industry. And that process created an absolutely hierarchical society where, like on paper, the workers owned the economy, but in practice, they were worked like dogs around the clock. With the sort of gulag slaves being the bottom tier, and then you get the farmers, then the factory workers, then trained workers, managers, specialists, all the way up to commissars and then the ministers. And it's a pretty brutal society, one in which you can very quickly move up or down the ladder in either direction at any time, or simply be kicked off the ladder entirely.
Right, and I mean it's kind of like this grotesque representation of what modernity means, that they created this machine to bootstrap the country into modernity, and the gradations of hierarchy in the machine were designed in like explicitly towards that purpose, right? Like at the very top you have the Politburo and the leadership of the Communist Party, who are moving the society in that direction, directing it towards that goal. And then underneath them, you have the technical workers, who are the ones who are actually going to get the ideas that are necessary in order to realize this image of the future. And then you have the workers, and so on, all the way down to the peasantry, and then the prisoners of the gulags. And it is meritocratic in a way that sort of earlier conceptions of modernity dreamed of, right? That like, oh, well, you're measured according to your worth. But the thing is that it creates this society of very intense preoccupation with status and extreme anxiety about status. Like you can always fall, right? Like, you know, you never know what's going to happen next. That one thing you say wrong, that one thing you do which is a misstep, and somebody's going to seize on that and just cast you down into oblivion, right? I mean, literally in the case of the Stalinist period, where you would just be taken out and shot or sent to Siberia and worked to death. But in the Khrushchev period, you'd just be, you know, sent off to Siberia to work some terrible bureaucratic post until the end of your days, right? And, you know, if you get one black mark on your permanent record, then your life is over. Just like that Galena in the previous chapter, right? She makes this one misstep in being uncouth, and then that's the end of her career.
Yeah, and you'd be condemned to just like kind of play out your days as a middle bureaucrat in some irrelevant shithole in the middle of the country. But like that's a kind of important point, that like, I mean, like Stalin's successors did tame that kind of weird savage growth machine, and life did improve and all those sorts of things afterwards. And they had these kind of like periods of pretty incredible growth. And there was a marked transition from the kind of militarism of the Stalinist period to a more sort of managerial tone later, especially under Khrushchev. But there was something kind of off about this growth, that like the growth was pretty good, but it was slowing at this point. And there was kind of problems with, I think ultimately the core of it seems to be that it was a very inefficient system, that the earlier Soviet growth was kind of fueled by cramming more inputs into the system. They weren't necessarily very good at producing the outputs, but like when you could just level an entire forest and feed it into the plywood making machine, then like you're going to have pretty incredible plywood output. But there was this kind of growing question of like, well, the growth is actually slowing down, and how are we going to stimulate it to take off again? Because, you know, the ambitions were still very lofty. They kind of wanted to actually hit these goals eventually, preferably within the century. So how do you keep this thing growing?
Yeah, well, within 20 years.
Yeah, like
Right.
that was from.
Or
He had very little time to pull this off
yeah.
because the target was 1980, I believe, was the year 1980.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, it
Full communism.
would have been a hell of a coup to actually pull it off. But that's where our boy Vitalovich comes back into the equation in 1960, where he's presenting at a conference for technologists, cyberneticians, and economists. This is a kind of an interesting chapter, yeah, where he's kind of like talking about his plan for a system that'll optimize the economy according to a plan that is set, but that it'll be a lot more efficient than what you could achieve otherwise, through a system of shadow prices that are dynamically recalculated constantly. He gets a bit of pushback from the Marxist-Leninist crowd, and is sort of accused of trying to just reconstruct some of the elements of capitalism that would be dangerous to the society.
Right, by introducing a price-driven system, then he is accused of reintroducing capitalism. And this is a very sort of fine point of economic theory that they are arguing over here.
Yeah.
But the sort of rebuttal that Kantorovich gives is that, well, yes, there are prices and they measure opportunity costs, but like these OD values are not market prices. They're prices that represent the fulfillment of the plan objectives, right? So on the surface level, they appear to be market prices, but they're not arrived at through a market. And the money that is used in this price system is not money in the capitalist sense, right? It doesn't have all the properties of money. It just has some of them. So, yeah, this is a rather fine point they're arguing over.
Yeah, definitely. And I kind of wonder, like, is it possible that, like, because it was such a fine point that it was quite easy to misunderstand throughout the whole society, and kind of like might have actually stymied the efforts to make it come about.
Like this is a thing that definitely came up in the socialist calculation debate, and it is a common accusation of these kinds of systems that, like, well, you're introducing prices, you're introducing profit questions, aren't you just reintroducing capitalism? And the really sort of key point there of whether it's a yes or no is, are the overall plan objectives materially different from those you would see in a profit-making market system, right? Like, are the social objectives that are being decided, which sort of indicate the boundary of the optimum, actually something that are like set in a rational way that is concerned with the qualitative details of what the society is trying to achieve, or are they just trying to get the most stuff?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And in that case, well, then it's pretty much just like capitalism, right? So that's where the detail lies. And as you said, it's one that Kantorovich would be vulnerable on, and it's why Boyarsky and his old guard political economist crowd were earlier able to denounce him, because it looks like it's just an argument for reintroducing capitalism, or something like the NEP.
Yeah, yeah. Fortunately, he does pick up some allies here, where there's like a sense of optimism for like what could be done with this kind of technique, and also a sense that like they're coming out of the kind of they're coming into a kind of an era where this kind of thought might be able to be entertained without getting them shot.
Yeah, and the important thing there is that, like, there's a changing of the guard that is happening, where adherence to a certain form of Marxist-Leninist dogma is being replaced by adherence to a dogma of the power of mathematics and the authority of mathematical exactitude. And this is what this debate is all about, right? Is like the reason why Boyarsky loses is because everybody in the room recognizes that that is the old game, and the new game is about scientific authority based on mathematical exactitude.
Yeah, and there's a sense that their day has come. That this guy's been biding his time for a while now, kind of developing these ideas, and there's a strong sense that this is the direction the future is going to take. And we get to see a little bit of that in the next chapter, where we see Lebedev, a computer designer, and it's a pretty light chapter in which he's kind of in the basement of the Institute of Precise Mechanics, and he's working with a new machine. There's a lot of language in the kind of thing of like describing energy flows through circuits and how they achieve the kind of logic. There's a lot in here about power, energy, and control, and how he as a technologist is able to kind of project power and control through the machine.
The machine is often described as like a faithful idiot, tireless. It's very concerned with like showing that the machine is kind of like a beast of burden or a laboring thing that isn't capable of thinking, and then showing how like Lebedev is entranced by the idea that this thing that is just providing rote operations or just doing them very quickly is able to start to produce meaning or some kind of thought-like stuff, right?
Yeah, definitely. And like it's the thing it's working on at the moment is potatoes, considered as an abstraction, and trying to optimize their movement around the economy in a way that a market in potatoes wouldn't be able to. It's kind of the explicit objective here. Even says like there's a kind of nice line that like the market's clock speed is laughable. So there's a strong sense of the technologists having like they've got the secret trick. They've got the one weird trick that makes all this good stuff possible that their opponents on the other side of the world just haven't cottoned on to yet.
Right, and so he's kind of like representing the socialist position that was championed by Oscar Lange about planning and calculation, and the sort of way that he's thinking about this problem is that the market is a computer that can only work out one solution, right? So it's essentially it's like a serial process, right? It can only in real time work out solutions to the coordination of supply and demand. Whereas a computer can, in parallel, run a number of different simulations about what the optimum might be. And then the planners could choose the best one. So it's kind of like you have predictive power, and you also have the power of being able to do parallel processing instead of just serial processing. And this is what he sees as like the decisive advantage of this rational planning system enhanced with computer technology.
Yeah, and it's a very convincing argument the way it's put. And it's like there's a lot of energy behind it, and there's a lot of like brightness and optimism, a real glow to the kind of language the character uses to think about these problems.
And there he has the same kind of misunderstanding about what the Soviet Union is, where he thinks that the planned economy is actually this rational thing, that is amenable to being enhanced in this way by computer programming. Right? Like that essentially giving out this plan and issuing these directives is already what the Soviet Union does. We're just going to do it better.
Yeah.
Right?
It's a real
Which is a
misapprehension.
deep misunderstanding of the way that the planning system actually works.
Yeah. It's like it's really kind of weird how far off the mark these guys were with their just or like how that society had managed to contain two distinct bubbles of thought that had no real interaction with each other and like weren't in a position to correct each other in any kind of meaningful way. And that these like two parallel tracks of work were happening under just like
exactly.
Yeah, complete misunderstanding.
And he was working from the image of the economy that was given by Gosplan's official descriptions, not the way it actually worked, right? Because that was privileged information that was held within the ranks of the managers and not given to people like him.
Yeah, they weren't in a position to know it at all. Just kind of the nature of that sort of society. The next chapter is one in which we're introduced to one Sasha Gallic. It was a writer. It was being sort of asked to draw up a sort of a compelling fiction of what life will be like in 1980. He seems to be very disillusioned at this point. This is 1961, and it's the day of the kind of party conference, I think, where Khrushchev announces the intention to kind of transition to cybernetic communism. But Galic's sort of way of describing this stuff is interesting in that, like, he says that Moscow is like a set. It's like it's quite nice to look at from certain angles, but then when you look at what's under the paint, it's a bit ratty and kind of like it's all kind of put on for show. And he doesn't seem to, even at this kind of early stage, doesn't seem to believe in the vision. You know, he's the first real voice of dissent that we hear in the book.
Right, and he, as a writer, he has enjoyed the freeing up of discourse that accompanied the rise of Khrushchev, but he also has begun to feel the limits of it. And what the kind of work that he is doing is, like, he's a kind of figure similar to someone who you might see working on doing the latest Marvel movie these days, right? Like, he's just producing kind of entertaining fluff. And this has bred a certain amount of cynicism in him. And I believe this person actually ended up defecting.
Right.
Yeah. But certainly he is dissatisfied. And this is meant to kind of show, like, what the life of the official writer class was like in the Soviet Union at this time, right?
He lives pretty well, seemingly. Especially the contrast with everyone else.
That's right. I remember when I was in the Czech Republic, I went to this place where the writers would get together and meet during the communist era, and it was literally a repurposed palace.
Nice.
Like, out of the countryside, just gonna get together and hobnob there, right? And it was just an old palace that was repurposed for the writers. And the person who was showing me around, who was a professor there, just evidenced, like, extreme disdain for everything that these people represented. So that gives you a sense of kind of, like, they're just hacks, right? Like, that's what they were raised to be, is hack writers. You know, in the same way that we might kind of make fun of a Thomas Friedman these days.
Yeah.
They're very much that sort of person, just these kind of sycophantic followers of the powerful. And, you know, if they have private misgivings about the system, they're not allowed to voice them and they keep them to themselves, right?
Yeah, he seems to know his position. Like he's aware that he is in a very privileged position in this kind of society, and he does seem to just keep his misgivings to himself. It's an interesting sort of look into the kind of firstly, yeah, into the sort of upper classes of this society, and also into somebody who's not completely on board with or at least doesn't seem to believe that this vision of plenty is actually possible. Yeah, and then part 3 sort of kicks off with a little bit of a rundown of how the Soviet Union kind of dismantled its university and education systems and kind of replaced it all with STEM and let the humanities wither entirely.
Well, I didn't let them wither. They actually just shot everyone.
Yeah, completely purged all the departments. Which is like, yeah, and like it'll turn out that this like hampered that state pretty badly, like that. Because like, I mean, so what they were doing was like, putting all their money into STEM, like all engineers and scientists and such, and like just pruning away all the other sort of branches. And this was like, especially because like they had this already supposedly perfected version of an orthodox Marxism that didn't need any further development, supposedly. And like, well, you don't need philosophers anymore if you figured out philosophy and all this kind of this way of thinking. And just completely got rid of everyone. And left themselves in a very bad situation, really.
The remaining social scientists fulfilled a role very similar to the role that economists fulfill in our society, which is to just kind of parrot a fairy tale version of a fairy tale of why the society is the best of all possible worlds, right? And the critical intellectuals were liquidated, right? And because the critical intellectuals were gone, that did create very, very serious problems for being able to realistically assess the problems of the society, and in a kind of sophisticated way, right? In a way that didn't approach all of the problems as engineering problems that you just had to solve using technical means. There is a formal similarity to what has happened under neoliberalism with what happened under Stalin, right? That no, they aren't taking us out back of the university and shooting us.
They don't need to. They can let you die on your own.
They just make sure that the departments are starved and there's no jobs and everything is put under the firm jackboot of an administrative class that removes any possibility of free thinking, right?
Yeah, definitely. It is eerily reminiscent of the present moment, and like especially in the kind of like the hegemonic sort of order today don't have anything resembling a critical theory of anything. Like they just sort of have the mindless regurgitation of the stuff they're accustomed to, which is kind of where the Soviets ended up here, where they had no longer had anyone that was capable of critiquing anything, so they couldn't develop anything new.
Yeah, and this blindness, I think, is kind of what Marcuse was getting at in One Dimensional Man, as sort of like a discussion of like where modernity ends up going. That there's no critical distance. But I mean, it just reminds me so much of what happened a few years ago in Japan, where the government was pretty much like, let's eliminate the humanities faculties from all the universities except the top ones. Like that was like a sort of directive from on high but I feel like that's happening through a kind of slower process of change throughout the world, right? There's a very conscious sense of crisis among humanists, and I feel that even if the social sciences are surviving to perhaps a somewhat greater extent than the humanities, there is the problem we discussed about earlier, or in our Graeber episode, about like we don't actually get any new ideas out of these departments anymore.
Yeah.
Right? Like that they're just kind of retreading old ground. And so it's very, very concerning, because when it comes to providing mature solutions or sort of complex and nuanced solutions to social problems, it is necessary to do some deep thinking in a way that isn't just about optimization, right? And about providing clever technical solutions, while ignoring the actual quote unquote implementation details, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the way that these early sort of figures we've been talking about see these problems, is like, oh, like, yeah, we're gonna come up with these awesome algorithms and these cool computers, and then everything else is just implementation details.
Yeah.
Well,
and that way of thinking really took root when like these science towns started to be established, where the scientists and engineers lived in kind of isolated bubbles that kind of, I suppose, resembled the future that the society as a whole was trying to get to, where they had a lot more freedom and a lot more access to resources than the main population did. But this then put them in a sort of bubble where they could, in some ways, sort of consider the difference between themselves, like the scientists in the science towns versus the quote engineers who ran the state, and they could kind of see with a little bit of distance, they could see the kind of stupidity of a lot of the running of the apparatus of the state, you know. Mm-hmm. And it sort of started to form a bit of a divide between the two classes. They would eventually be brought back into line.
Hey everyone, Shane here. We had to split this recording session into 2 episodes, so join us again in 2 weeks for part 2 of our discussion of Red Plenty. In the meantime, you can find us on Twitter at GIUnitPod. We're on Facebook as General Intellect Unit. We're on all the podcasting apps. So if you haven't done so already, please do subscribe, like, rate, or just share us with your friends. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks.